everyone, and welcome back to another version of our Reimagine 2020 virtual conference series. This is version 4, and this time we're bringing you a special spooktacular for Halloween, Tales from the Crypto. And today I'm here with Sinjin David Jung, Managing Director at the International Blockchain Reserve. He's working on the Asia Reserve currency coin. Sinjin, thank you for being here. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you for having me, Ashlie.
Yeah, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in. I'm your co-host, Ashlie Meredith, head of education at MouseBelt Blockchain Accelerator, and we have a university program. So consequently, a lot of the people tuning in right now are students from all over the world. And so when we bring interviewees on, we want to ask them, speaking to all the students out there, tell us about your journey. How did you get interested in blockchain? I know that you're a lifelong student, passionate about learning, have studied a lot of different things. What was your journey from pursuing what you were interested in and now bringing that into the blockchain space?
I think it's twofold. I'm a little older than I look. I'm 45 at the moment. And so when I had gone into blockchain, it was 2017 May. And I had actually sold my national fintech company that I had in the Philippines to Alibaba and Financial and another company called CP Group Thailand. They're like the biggest conglomerate in Thailand. They're about like 30% bigger than Samsung. Yeah. Out here in like the West, if I say some of the names of the Asian companies I've worked with, people don't really understand how big they are, but they were two very big companies. And, and Financial's going for like pretty much the biggest IPO like ever. They're going to raise like 36 billion. So that company had bought me out at that time. And so I was left with nothing to do happily for the first time in my life. And a friend of mine had asked me for some advice. And he said that a mid-sized Hong Kong bank, investment bank wanted to open up a crypto desk. And I said, what are you talking about? And my friend had asked me that for advice on what he should negotiate for his investment desk. I said, wait a sec. Why would a mid-sized investment bank be doing that? And then he went to tell me about Ethereum and what had gone on with the developments. And, previous to fintech, so I had a fintech company in the Philippines. I was in online casino gambling and poker. So there's a company called Poker Stars, and I was the regional director for Asia, and I actually legalized poker in Macau. And I had introduced the game of poker actually to most of Asia in like multiple markets. And so I was aware about Bitcoin right in like 2011-ish, because, in the gaming world, payment processing and moving of funds and stuff like that is very important. It's very essential for the market. But I wasn't aware of what had happened with Ethereum. And then after he had explained to me what was going on with smart contracts and Ethereum and stuff like that, I went to go and meet a few other people, and they explained to me that, if you read Satoshi's white paper and you look at it from a purely economic point of view, you think to yourself, on a very practical point of view as well, is that, it has value because it's like this kind of decentralized system and it's secured that way, but does it really have any real value? And for most people who have that kind of like intellectual leap, it doesn't, because they're like, well, what is it kind of based on? And you don't really understand the value until you kind of jump down the rabbit hole and you realize, hey, what really is decentralization, right? And once you kind of understand that, not from a centralized point of view, but purely on its own, then you're like, oh my God, like, this is the most amazing thing ever. Like, to not have intermediaries, no middlemen, to have a shared infrastructure where you can build things off of, and, how big is the value there? And then I thought to myself, wow, this is probably the biggest, technological advancement since the internet. And, I was a grad student when the internet was in full throttle, right? I was, an undergraduate when I got my first, email on, the Pine system, and we were still using the Unix to chat, Unix systems with the green keyboard, green font to everybody. Yeah. So I'm pretty like I went through that, but I'm like 3 years younger than the Google founders and stuff like that. But it's kind of like I was really there, but I couldn't really touch it because I was still a student. And I had been part of like the online gaming boom and stuff like this. And when I saw this, I realized this is like the kind of culmination of all those technologies layered upon it. And then I thought to myself, you know what? I really don't want to get into something new, but this is so amazing. And then I spent about 2 weeks thinking about what would be the most amazing thing you could do working in the decentralized field with cryptocurrencies. And I thought, first thing I thought about, like, well, what didn't I do in another like gaming thing, like some type of game, decentralized gaming, P2P stuff like that. And, at that time in 2017 in May, it was still kind of like early days, for the ICOs. It really hadn't hit that boom yet, but it was really getting like so much momentum, and people were, making money left and right with these white papers and like, 8-page white papers on a website and a countdown timer. And they're like making whatever, 20, 30, 40 million in terms of raising. But I thought to myself, hey, you know what? Like, this is such an amazing, innovation that, could I just not, like, what could I really pick that could really match that? And then I thought to myself, well, what if we did like some kind of reserve currency? Because the thing that has always bothered me the most is that when I was living in Southeast Asia, I had been living in like Macau in like a, 5-star casino suite for like 3 years. And I had had all these luxuries. And then I had decided to go into emerging markets because I had worked for this one family office. And then we had done this fintech payment system, which was supposed to like, bank the unbankable and, do this financial inclusion. And I realized it wasn't helpful at all, because a lot of these countries had so much corruption that, people simply couldn't earn a living because, we talk about in the United States during the pandemic, we talk about systemic racism. And, that's a kind of language that's kind of always been there, but it hasn't been at the forefront of conversation. But in Southeast Asia, you don't need a pandemic to see how bad systemic, corruption is. It's just all around you, to the point where everyone just kind of accepts it. And myself being trained as a strategist, I just couldn't find a solution all that time I was working there. I mean, my professional background was that I actually worked for the Korean government as a technology negotiator, analyst. And I worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers as a negotiator and a strategist, right? For, just basically mergers and acquisitions, as well as, on the regulatory side. And I think I'm pretty good at my job. I think, I can take really complex, organizations and find a framework, make them work together, look at the long-term kind of outlook and possibilities. But I couldn't for the life of me look at it and say like there was anything that could actually solve this like problem, because, you go to these countries where even though they're democracies, the people are incentivized with very short-term incentives per election, and there's a lot of corruption regarding that, and people cannot kind of generate their own power base, or they don't have infrastructure like basic roads and water, and so they're always trying to survive. How do you solve something like that? And after a couple of weeks, I realized, if we could provide them with some sort of stability that they had direct access to, right? Whether it was Bitcoin or something like this, it would make a massive difference in their life. But, Bitcoin, and I love the Bitcoin maximalists, I really do. And I love Satoshi, whoever he is. And the white paper I've read like over 30 times. I'm not even kidding, right? Because, the more that, you understand of how things are kind of playing out, the more just amazing that paper is in terms of like, how much it's a very, it's very deceiving. The Bitcoin white paper, it's like 9 pages, or actually like 8 pages, whatever, with the footnotes, right? 9 with the footnotes. But like, that paper is built on like 20 years of cryptography and like understanding and development to come to that point where they write it. But long story short is that, I thought to myself, hey, well, I did study economic development and, political economy when I was younger. And, it's been like 25 years and there still hasn't been any progress for all this technology in these markets. And I thought, well, let me tackle that problem. So let me tackle the problem of solving global inequality. And that's how I started on this road of 4 years of hard learning. I tell you that. It's not been easy. Yeah.
Absolutely. So yeah, just to go back a bit, you already had an entire career, right? Had a successful exit from one of your companies,
Yeah.
and then discovered blockchain and started all over again in a new industry. What was that experience like? How did you get up to speed on everything that was going on in the space?
Um, I really credit it to like my management consulting background. When you're a management consultant and you get trained as such, um, you basically have 2 weeks to figure out everything there is to know about the industry, and then you got to pitch the CEO of the industry. And what people don't realize is that a lot of times management consultants don't get hired to fix things. They get hired to manage growth. And so, there are certain things and tools that you normally do. And one thing is, you read all the literature you can online. And amazingly enough, 2017, there was nothing online. It's like the first
Right.
time, yeah, you're looking at the internet and there's nobody knows anything. Everyone's kind of making it up. And if it kind of works, suddenly people say that's the gold standard now. This is how you should do an ICO. This is how you should, set up an ERC20 token. This is how you should do your minting process and stuff like that. So the main thing is, you kind of get the base knowledge, but then you want to go and you want to learn from people who have actually done it. So site visits or whatever like that. And so I got my friends who were traders, who were ex-poker players, who became day traders, who became crypto traders. And one of them had, at the beginning of 2017, he had 30K US. At the time that I met him in May, he had 1.14 million US dollars from 30K US.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, these are like unbelievable stories, right? I mean, it's just what, and so, and these guys, like when they were part of like poker and they had like their own small groups on Telegram where they would just basically, learn off one another. And so I had asked my friends to basically do introductions for me. And then after getting these introductions, I just basically went back and just started reading a lot more about, the craziest thing to learn was monetary, economic, and policy. You could do business your entire life and never touch anything to do with the Fed other than what the interest rate's going to be, right? And to actually like learn how is money really being printed, what is fractional like banking, how does monetary policy really affect the money supply? What is the money supply, like M1, M2, M3? You could go your entire life doing business and you'd never have to answer these questions. And then for me, even like in economics, it's like kind of like a half a chapter and that's about it. And then for me to like have gone back and studied for about a year some really like material that was just basically on how central banks work. How does the Federal Reserve work? I mean, I read Ray Dalio's book on the big debt crisis, right? Before he had actually turned into a book, when it was like this 200-page like PDF, and I devoured it, and I read it for about like 3 months or something like that. And so it was a lot of trying to understand, when you have this new technology, I mean, it's basically solving a problem, right? And then trying to find out like what problem is it really solving, and then realizing it was trying to solve the problem with, how, centralized financial systems work. And then, how does debt and credit and the debt credit cycle work and within all that and stuff like that. And so getting that background, then I could reapproach and really understand the problem. And then I could really understand the solution. Because you gotta think about it, is really crazy is that in the crypto space, a lot of people are really young. They're in their 20s. Now they're in their late 20s, but when they first started, they were like early 20s and stuff like that. And they're jumping into it, and their minds were so open to what is decentralization. I swear to God, it took me 2 months to really understand what the hell they're really talking about in terms of decentralization. I'd be like, okay, so is this solution decentralized? And they go, no, that's not really decentralized enough. I'm like, okay, how about this? And they'll be like, no, that's not enough. I'm like, okay, I know these kids are really smart and they're definitely smarter than me, and I still don't understand them. But
so if you had to give a blurb about what you've come to understand decentralization really means, how would you put it?
Okay, so I use the analogy of Uber. Okay, so number one is, I think what people get caught up on is they don't understand that decentralization means a decentralized network, right? It's not just decentralized. If you just say decentralized, it just means chaos, right? It just means like everyone's doing whatever they want to do. I mean, it's organized into a network, right? So when you have Uber, you have a centralized network where, you know, you have the drivers, and the more drivers there are, then the more, you know, coverage that they have, and the better it is service for the users, right? And so you create that, what we call network effects, right? So like every connection creates another connection, and the availability connections create exponential amount of connections, like Metcalfe's law. And, you know, just like the telephone, if I have one telephone, you have one telephone, that's only one connection. But if 20 people have telephones, then the network itself has such an exponential value there, right? But the problem with a centralized system is that, you know, even though the network is expanding, as soon as it gets to kind of a critical mass of coverage, if you have more people on the network, like as in terms of cars for Uber, then it's actually a lot better for the user. Instead of waiting 4 minutes, they're now waiting 1 minute or even 30 minutes. But the drivers themselves get less and less and less value. So how are they able to survive? They're not really able to survive. But the network itself, which is taking a percentage of all of the fees from all the drivers, they were able to optimally price where they can keep the drivers enough to keep the network at critical mass, but not pay them enough that they have, you know, a way to kind of make a sustainable amount of living, right? It becomes a burden, right? And then when that network's in place, other networks can't be in place. I mean, Lyft is actually $1 billion company as well, but compared to Uber, they're a small $1 billion company because of these kind of network effects. Same thing like where Facebook is there. So like, you want to cancel Facebook, but you really can't because there's no other Facebook equivalent to kind of go to. And that's the power of a centralized network. But here's the killer thing of a decentralized network. And it's something that it's still not really flushed out yet. And this is something that I work on every day. But a decentralized network would be this. You have a network like Uber, but if it's decentralized, meaning that it's not a centralized authority, then basically in a decentralized network, every time there's a new driver that enters into the network, the network value increases, but so does the value of the driver increase. So imagine in a decentralized Uber model that every single driver not only received revenue, but they had an equity share, okay, in the company. So it doesn't matter, even if there's new drivers coming on, their equity would increase as well. But to take it one step further, their equity would change or increase on a kind of dynamic level, just because like if they're contributing or how many people are contributing or how many people are not contributing, you'd have this kind of dynamic equity kind of flow, right? And that, every single node would also be increasing in value rather than just the single centralized node being increasing in value. So, there's that George Glider book, After Google. Have you read that?
I have not, but I think you've mentioned 2 books now that I think we should recommend to all the students out there.
Yeah.
What was the last one again?
After Google by George Glider.
Google. Awesome.
George Glider is like one of the preeminent like tech visionaries. He's so amazing. He's in his 90s or something now. He's like really super old, and he wrote this book like maybe like four years ago. And basically he describes and he basically predicted the internet, like this guy, like in a lot of these technologies, like 2 decades before, like this is probably going to happen and stuff like this. And he talks about how Google and how these tech companies have created their own kind of technocratic kind of world, but that doesn't really fit in with the rest of the world, like their values and so on and so forth. And they begin to pass because it's just a platform. And he says, but the greatest thing will be when you decentralize these platforms. And this is like the second half of the book. And so you're like, wow, the first half of the book was so amazing. I can't wait to get the second half of the book. And the second half of the book is the biggest letdown in the history of books, because the first half was so good. And the second half basically says like nothing. Like it's just very, very broad, abstract. And I think that's what the difficulty is. I mean, we're in really exciting times where we are now defining what those decentralized networks can be, right? Whether it's decentralized healthcare or like decentralized gig services and so on and so forth. Because you look at now in the pandemic situation, where before there was a pandemic, the gig economy was going, people were making somewhat of a wage, and, companies had the information to create a network that had incentives enough to maintain their critical mass, but not pay more than that, right? But now when the pandemic hits, right, these people who are gig workers, they have no equity, have nothing, and they've just been totally wiped out. And they had no savings either, because they were living basically month to month. Because like if you're an Uber driver, you have to pay for your insurance, your own gas, your own car, so on and so forth. And then if you don't have any drivers, you don't have anyone to pick up because of the pandemic, you're just gone. Whereas Uber still at the very end, I mean, their business took a hit, but they still had equity, right? So, we think all these models are so wonderful and so great. And even now, like in the pandemic right now, you have these massive tech companies which are still accruing so much value. I mean, NASDAQ has basically led the way for this, maintaining the stock levels, right? But the Main Street, the people who are actually working out there who are not part of these tech companies that have global networks and, bajillion-dollar server farms, I mean, they have literally nothing in this particular situation. I mean, they've gotten hit so hard, right? And I think what George is kind of looking at is saying like this exponential technology of wealth is being created to the point where, we're at the verge of singularity, where you have all this data, and then this data is like gone into sorted out by algorithms, and then you have machine learning, which is taking this data and then revising like what's the application of this data, and then we're getting to the point where we're having like AI, where it's going to really optimize, how we apply this data and so on and so forth. But where does this leave the average person who is part of our society, other than they're a consumer or they are a feeder of data? Like nowhere, right? But if they're organized in some sort of decentralized network, which either in some ways helps them like take ownership of their data, or they can participate in some sort of network that utilizes the technology, then we're actually sharing in all of this technology. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because I am part of the 1% that is wealthy enough that the pandemic hasn't really affected us. If anything, I got fatter during the pandemic because I was able to go to Costco and just buy a whole bunch of stuff, right? And Amazon Fresh and stuff like that. But like, how do we make technology participatory, right? And I think that's what's really important, because if what a lot of tech guys think is that, I'm Jeff Bezos, I'm, Mark Zuckerberg, and I'm an entrepreneur, so I deserve all these gains, right? But, Mark Zuckerberg and Amazon, they couldn't have done these without the underlying technologies that were there, the infrastructure, right? Whether it was the broadband back in 1999 that was there, whether it's logistics, whether it's smartphones, which allow logistics to be even more effective, right? And so like the gains that we're getting exponentially now in technology isn't only due to entrepreneurship. And I'm not going to take away from entrepreneurship. Absolutely, people need to be incentivized for entrepreneurship. But at a certain point, when you're making billions of dollars a year on basically very little cost, and you control that infrastructure, I mean, based on other infrastructure that's been, there before you, I mean, you're basically hoarding all this wealth. And for me, when you get down to talking about wealth in a decentralized network, you're hoarding incentives, right? And then you get to pick and choose where these incentives go, right? Because with wealth, you have, the power to choose to do what you want to do, or be motivated to do what you want to do. And if we boil it down, that wealth is essentially incentives, and you're basically just concentrating all this into one person to decide, that's actually stifling a lot of potential technology and innovation for the future. When you have the VCs or these big corporations, they decide. And I'll give you a really good example of this is South Korea. South Korea, we have this thing called chaebols, and they are basically huge family multinationals. So you were in Korea, and then I'm sure you saw how many Samsung and LG signs there are, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So my uncle was actually vice president for LG Electronics. So I know this very well. I was basically, raised with that kind of environment where, you're a very corporate family, and, you do rice cookers, you do, even Samsung has its own car brand in Korea, right? At one certain point, right? I mean, like, you could get a Hyundai, like, whatever, like a hair dry blower. I mean, they literally produce everything. But because they have such a lock on Korean society, there's probably only about, I would say, 12 to 15 major conglomerates in Korea that they basically do everything. And so if you're a startup, you have no chance to actually be innovative, because no one's going to give you capital, because all the VCs are the Korean conglomerates, and all the distribution channels are owned by the Korean conglomerates. So even if you got like a foreign VC from America to come and invest with you, if you didn't have a local like distribution partner or a local conglomerate partner, you wouldn't be able to operate in Korea anyways, right? And the only thing that has disrupted in Korea that has allowed this to kind of expand has been like, you know, the internet. So during the time of the internet, we had like game companies and internet companies come out, and they became their own kind of conglomerates, like Jaeburs as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a really good example. Like when you start to control that much wealth and technology and distribution and data, you know, unless we have a decentralized solution, we're actually going to harm ourselves for the future, because we aren't going to really let innovation just kind of be. And so I love the craziness of the crypto market. I love the youth of it. I love DeFi experimentation, although they should audit a little bit more, and people shouldn't throw like millions of dollars into like some unaudited smart contract. But I think it's awesome. I think it's super awesome. And I've learned so much from all their just independent thinking, you know, and just being able to do something. And, you know, like where Mark Andreessen says, like in, I don't remember, 2011 or something like that, about like how software will eat the world. And crypto is exactly like that. You can like code a smart contract and deploy it and hopefully get an audit on it in like, let's say reasonably a month. Okay. I know like DeFi was doing it in 3 days, but let's say a month, right? And then that's it. And then you're good to go. And that's like, you know, it has payment rails in terms of like, if it's on Ethereum, you know, people can put in the Ethereum and lock it in, or and then you have like Compound and everybody else who's kind of, or Dharma that's doing lending and like locking protocols and stuff like that. It's awesome, you know, just the code and then it's there. And there's no like deployment cost at all, right? Virtually nothing. Like maybe if you want to have a URL in your own website, okay, right? But it's, you know, but even doing something like if you're going to launch any kind of software, even like mobile, like on iPhone or Android, like even like whatever 6 years ago, right? You'd have your own server costs, you'd have all this, but like if you're going to launch a smart contract, it's like nothing, right? So it's just, I think it's a super amazing time, and I'm hopeful that, you know, all this kind of temptation to kind of just commercialize everything, that we kind of get past this, because I think a lot of times is you look at like what you could do decentralized networks on, but everyone just says tokenize this, tokenize that. And it's always commercial based, right? Tokenize real estate, create liquidity for this, create liquidity like that. And they're always talking about tokenization in terms of accessibility, but they're not talking about tokenization in terms of creating a network. And I think this is where the intellectual fall off happens, where you have people who are trying to commercialize blockchain technology, but they don't understand that it has to be in a network. Whereas those people who are doing a lot of the innovation in blockchain technology, they don't realize it has to be a network either, because they're so young that everything they're doing is in a network, right? Yeah. So it's a given. So there's this gap between like the old commercialization, you know, whatever, vultures who see the blockchain as something that they can really commercialize and do something with, and them not understanding that it needs to be in a network. It needs to be participatory. It needs to share revenue. It needs to be a fair launch. It can't just be something you're kind of grabbing onto and utilizing the way that they're used to utilizing, because they're trying to wield the power as if it's still a centralized thing where they make a decision and they make the profit. And this is what I'm saying, like going back to that Uber thing, is that if you had something where it was decentralized network for something like ride sharing, you know, it would survive even a pandemic, because there would still be equity in the network itself shared. Right? So you could say, hey, look, I might not be in a job right now, but I have equity in this company and it's going to come back, and it has started to come back. And this can be, you know, used to lock it in for credit for US dollars or whatever like that, your, you know, decentralized, you know, ride sharing tokens or whatever, right? And it can all be done without having to go to the bank at all, right? So I think really exciting times. And I think as we, you know, move past, as you said about, I think your own company, how you were looking to support real projects during the ICO period, as we're kind of finally moving into that period, I think, especially with all the institutional like interest with Bitcoin, I hope we really, like don't like put down the free spirit of crypto innovation, but also, you know, try to get into more meaningful applications that are really including people. I mean, you talk about like even mainstream participation. And I think it needs to be mainstream participation, not mass market penetration, you know? Mass market penetration being a product to like get people to sign up. So they think, oh, like PayPal, like, oh, PayPal, like doing crypto, that's great, right? But that's like really mainstream penetration. That's not really mass market participation, especially if they don't have their own private keys, so.
Right, right. Well, I love that you are harping so much on this idea of participation, because I mean, we've even used that word talking about the aim of this REIMAGINE 2020 virtual conference series, the university program that we run as a vehicle to source projects for our investment arm, MouseBelt Blockchain Accelerator. Bringing this education to people so that they can be participants in a system and not just beholden to the systems, right? So it's really about empowering people to participate and not just have things kind of happen to you, right? Because at some point there are going to be a lot of blockchain solutions that are running in the background, and people might not even know that they're using blockchain. But while this technology is revolutionizing things, you can have a say, right, in what products get built and how they're used. And what makes me really excited about working with students is that I think that younger generation is getting disillusioned by a lot. Like most young people don't use Facebook, right? The engineers who are being trained in university now, who maybe a couple years before would have been dreaming to work at Google, now kind of sees them as the enemy. And we want to inspire people to choose to join industries that respect privacy, that are, you know, have these values of censorship resistance. And I think that from what I'm seeing, at least, you know, younger people and students and engineers now, you know, they want to work for companies that have different ethics, you could say.
Yeah. And I think this comes down to, you know, what I believe about singularity. And, you know, I think singularity is absolutely coming. But, you know, we have to recognize that singularity is coming not because we're geniuses, it's because the world has gotten these innovations where we're so networked, and we're like kind of a network upon a network upon a network. I'll give you a really good example is that in Southeast Asia, e-commerce has surprisingly enough, they have like the mobile and the telecommunication network to do e-commerce. So, you know, they have broadband access, they have mobile access, you know, they have a lot of sufficient like web programmers and developers and so on and so forth. And they have data centers, right? But what they don't have is a safe public transportation system. What they don't have is roads where it's not traffic logged from, you know, 8 o'clock in the morning to 8 p.m. at night. So I'll give you an example is that in 2005, Korea's e-commerce revenue exceeded traditional retail revenue in 2005.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the reason for that is because, you know, in Korea we have broadband like everywhere, and, you know, technology and stuff like that. It's awesome. But for logistics, Korea is like the size of like Rhode Island. Okay. South Korea is like, it's tiny. Right. But how people would deliver one-day packages that they would get like the Autobite, we say like part-timers, high school part-timers, and they would go and they would pick up like a literally like a huge box like this of like 10 items. And then they would go on the subway station in Seoul, right? And then they would literally go on and off the subway system, and they would deliver the packages, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because Korea is like, you know, small but super organized and stuff like that, right? But the funny thing is, like, I remember when I was a university student and I was still taking the subway and stuff like that, I would see these kids passed out in the subway with, you know, a box of electronic goods just sitting at their feet, and no one would steal it, you know, because it's totally safe, you know. But like if you're in the Philippines or Indonesia and you're delivering a cell phone, which is, you know, 3 times your salary, right? Like, are you gonna not take it, or are you gonna take it? Number one. Number two is that, you know, how much packages can you put on a, you know, motorcycle? Because if you're using a truck, you're going to be stuck in traffic for 3 hours to go 5 miles, because that's the way the infrastructure is. And so, you know, you look at you take it for granted, but having roads, having safe public transportation, having safety. Another example is, again, in the Philippines, where an ATM machine has to be inside a store, because if it's not, some guy is going to basically pick it up and take it, you know?
Yeah.
And, you know, if you have an ATM in the store, you're also going to need a security guard with a shotgun at every ATM that has a store, because if you don't, like, it could get robbed as well, right? Or people going there and get robbed. So there's that, you know, people don't realize that, you know, the rule of law or this like infrastructure of safety is also, you know, cost there. But to get to the point of singularity, I think, you know, one crazy thing about social media and all this connectivity is that we know what's going on. Like, I get most of my news from Twitter, actually, in New York. You know, I check out whatever's there, and you get it so quickly. So if people think, you know, you see these futuristic movies where, like, Elysium, where like there's like the have-nots, they're on the ground in Earth, and then you have Elysium, you have like they're living up in outer space.
Right.
That is a complete fantasy, because I guarantee if social inequality got to that point, there's no way Elon is going to blast off on his rocket ships, okay? There are going to be hordes of people destroying everything, like the test site, the rockets, everything, before that happens, before we get to that level of, you know, disparity. And so it's funny, though, because like the more connected we are, the more aware of the inequality that we do become, right? And the more aware of we've become about how our data is being used, right? And so I think the biggest thing that's going to stop our technological advancement as human beings is the fact that if we don't solve this issue of inequality, we're just not going to simply move forward. You know, the more efficient we become at using resources and so on and so forth, right? The more that we're taking the resources from the earth itself, the more climate change becomes an issue, right? But if you are a multimillionaire, and this is a fact, I mean, there were a lot of Silicon guys who had a safe house in, you know, a safe place in New Zealand, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so they could just basically fly over to New Zealand before the quarantine hit, and then they're like sitting pretty. I mean, but the average person who is not generating all this money from industry or from stocks or whatever like that, climate change hits or COVID hits, I mean, they're not running off to the Hamptons, they're not running off to, you know, Nantucket or whatever like that. I mean, they're staying put, and they're going to have to deal with what's going to have to happen, right? And so I think ultimately, you know, as you know, singularity approaches, and as you know, data and these advances happen, we're also going to be aware of how these advances are proceeding. And I don't think human population is just going to accept that. I think humanity is going to say, hey, wait a second, this just isn't right. You know, what's the point of having progress if it's not for humanity, right? If it's just for the sake of having progress, and then who controls that progress? And what's the point then?
Progress for progress's sake. I've always been critical of the idea. It kind of reminded me of a book I read recently. Forgive me, I don't remember the author's name, but it's called Abolish Silicon Valley. And it's really kind of a memoir. And I definitely think it could have gone deeper into some of the ideas, but she was just outlining her story of being a Silicon Valley startup founder and all of the kind of toxicity that she encountered, and kind of learning more about socialist ideas, going to graduate school, and that maybe there's a way, or that there should be more social ownership of technological innovation, that governments should really make an effort to like these products that people are developing should be for the benefit of society. This technological progress should be owned in some part by the people it's supposed to help. It's not just you should be the richest billionaire in the world and not get taxed because you created jobs that are minimum wage and people can hardly survive on. It sounds like what you're saying is ultimately, if you are just creating all these products and these technological advancements, but this wealth inequality is getting greater and greater, that ultimately that's actually going to put us backwards as far as technological.
I think like, just to put it on, like, for one thing is I'm a very firm non-socialist take on it, just because I think at the end of the day, innovation requires incentive. Okay, you take away this incentive, No one's going to do anything anyways, right? But how do you counterbalance this incentive, right? To the point where the government doesn't have to step in, because to say that governments don't need to step in is, it's just ridiculous. It's just wishful thinking, because if governments didn't step in during the pandemic, right, and didn't do the stimulus checks that they had done, or, you know, done the coordination they had done, then the entire financial system would have collapsed. Absolutely. For all those people who are like super hardcore, you know, Milton Friedman, you know, maximalists, you know, whatever like that, you know, Marx can do Reaganists or whatever like that. I mean, the government did a lot, right? But in normal times, I would say though, like if you're talking about continual progress, you have to keep those incentives. But what I'm saying is that we have to organize a counter set of incentives as well, right? Because if you left people to their own devices, they're only going to create more inequality, and they're going to be their own worst enemy. And before we get to that point where the government has to step in and basically try to also in a centralized way correct that, can we create a competing decentralized version of what's centralized to keep things in check, right? Centralized probably will always be more efficient. You have a charismatic, awesome leader who's super intelligent. Like I would say probably Jeff Bezos. I don't know the guy personally, but I think, you know, he's got balls. I mean, if I'm sorry, that's politically incorrect. Sorry, Korea. So, but he's got the cajoles or whatever they call it, where, you know, he did it. He, you know, he left his Wall Street hedge fund job. I mean, he was, you know, not profitable for years. I mean, analysts came after him and he stuck to his guns. Maybe he was a little bit vindictive with one particular analyst. I forget his name, but poor guy. But he said, I believe in this vision. I'm going to go for it. And he did, you know, and he made it, right? And not to take anything away from that at all. I mean, that's an amazing thing. But, you know, what he's created, though, ultimately, in the vision that he's had for it, it's efficient, but, you know, is it the best for society at a certain level, right? But it does work. And it has disrupted the traditional analog kind of industry, right? But if we're talking like networks to networks, okay, a centralized network versus another centralized network isn't going to win the day. Once you're a centralized network, you got it. Once you're Facebook, there's never going to be another social media network exactly like Facebook that's going to be able to destroy Facebook. Just like Google, what was it called even? I don't remember. Google Hangouts, Google Circle. Remember what it was?
Oh, Google Plus.
Yeah, Google Plus. And they got decimated, you know? They got decimated by Zucky. And Zucky was like, oh, and all hands on deck, let's go ahead and destroy it. So you can't go head to head with another centralized network. It's just not going to work. But if we can create a decentralized network, and what's beautiful about decentralized network is you can't just create it from one node. A community has to agree, and then suddenly it's no longer chicken and the egg. It just immaculate consumption. It works, right? And it works because it's always going to work because of the participation. Like, you can't kill Bitcoin unless people don't want to participate. As long as there's people who want to participate in Bitcoin, it will still always live. It might not live in a healthy form, but it will never fully die. And so if we can create and seed these decentralized networks to act as a kind of counterbalance, or even a way to, how do I say, reconcile or redeem these centralized networks, right? Because ultimately, I think what centralized networks have shown us is that capitalism really works. It's awesome. It is definitely the best thing since sliced bread. I mean, it's definitely better than centralized planning, better than communism, socialist, if you want to have a really great result, right? It allocates resources effectively, you know, it penetrates the market effectively, you know, it's to the point, there's no politicizing, you know, it's going to make money, and, you know, you're going to put your inputs in and you're going to get your return out, and you're going to have the pressure from the market, you're going to have pressure from debt, and you're going to reinvest, and you're going to go for it. But what it has definitively shown as well is that nowhere involved with capitalism is the need to have participation or the need to share revenue, right? It always happens at the end. So it's a question of redistribution or taxes. And then you kind of take away the incentive of the people who are doing it, right? But if you're talking competitively, if Jeff Bezos lost money because there was another competitor, he wouldn't whine about it. In fact, he would try harder to figure out how to make more money or to have more of an edge to counter his competitor. Now, if that competitor was a decentralized network that had, instead of one main owner, Jeff Bezos, but had, you know, 10 million participatory, you know, people as members, right? And it could never die.
then people would actually have a choice between the two, right? And then the incentives and the rewards and the wealth generated in this whole market of what we call e-commerce could be split between the two, right? And Jeff naturally would be, how do I say, limited in his scope or his wealth, not because we taxed him more, not because the government stepped in, was because there was a legitimate competition. But that's the problem. Once you have a centralized network in our modern digital economy, which is based off other, layered on other networks, you can't get rid of them, right? Mm-hmm. But then they become their own worst enemy as well. And so my thesis, and I've actually written a manifesto, which I haven't published yet. And I'm just publishing it for free, obviously, just because it's the manifesto for IBMR, deals with this whole issue is that, why should people care about inequality? And my reasoning is, if you love technology, and if you want technology to progress, you need to care about inequality, because technology is the main driver of this exponential wealth, which is creating this divide even quicker than it has ever been, even more so than globalization. And if you want technology to succeed, you got to care about equality, because we got to get there all together, or we're not going to get there at all, right? So
absolutely. Well, that's a perfect segue then into we've been kind of really high level here, conceptual issues of decentralization and incentivizing certain behaviors and creating more access and addressing inequality. So I want the viewers to be able to know more about what you're doing with IBMR and reserve currencies. And, for all the students tuning in, maybe really quickly explain what a reserve currency is and how you're approaching the problem.
Okay, so really quickly, IBMR is International Blockchain Monetary Reserve. As I told you, I was sitting at my table for 2 weeks trying to figure out what's the biggest thing I thought of, and I thought I should pick the most pompous name I can think of, and so just to kind of peg the scope at it. So I thought IMF, International Monetary Fund, and they're kind of top down, and we'd be like bottom up, so International Blockchain Monetary Reserve. And why I picked reserve as well is because going into reserve currencies is that the biggest thing is for mainstream adoption is that they need to feel like there's some kind of asset there, right, to tie it in. Bitcoin is Bitcoin. Nothing is going to replace Bitcoin, because Bitcoin's real value is decentralized network that creates security for Bitcoin, right? And I think there can only be one Bitcoin. I'm sorry to like Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV and Bitcoin Gold and Diamond or whatever like that. But for me, if I'm going to say like, as much as I could think of myself as a Bitcoin maximalist, it's just BTC, that's it. But like in terms of what a reserve currency normally is that, you have a peg currency, which, it's 1-to-1 to the US dollar, or in the case of Hong Kong, it's like 7.8 Hong Kong dollars to the $1 US, and they maintain that peg. But if you look at something like Korean won or the Japanese yen or Chinese renminbi, as a reserve currency, or Singapore dollar, what they have is they have massive foreign reserves. Okay, so they have a basket of foreign reserves. Most of it's US dollars, some of it's Canadian dollars, Swiss dollars, euros, whatever like that. And so when there's price pressure on their coin or on their fiat currency, they can actually use some of their foreign current reserves to, basically defend their currency, right? But normally they don't do that. Essentially what ends up happening is that if you have a big enough foreign currency reserve, none of the Forex traders want to deal with you, because they know that you can just smash them back. But again, a good example I think was Venezuela, and all the issues with Venezuela right now.
Yeah.
But Venezuela, like just a few years back, I think 5 or 6 years back, they had a foreign currency reserve of something like 50 billion, okay, of US dollars. Not bad at all, okay? Obviously they have a lot of gas and everything like that. And then the government, in order to keep the price of their currency up, they would spend that 50 billion US dollars to defend their price. But when they got to 10 billion, like, it's basically the emperor has no clothes, because like, what are you going to do? Spend the rest of your 10 billion? So like a foreign currency reserve or a reserve currency
actually the focus is not really on maintaining the peg. It's really on growing the fund, like as if it was an endowment fund, and
Right.
using the interest or using the clout of that to dissuade people to attack and create stability. Because at the end of the day, you can talk about risk and reward and incentives and like whatever like that, but money and the value of money all comes down to confidence and stability. So if the reserve has like, I guess, the inflow of growth there, then the price that's related, the currency that's related to the reserve, in theory should be stable. And so for me, I thought to myself, if I was going to, create a mainstream cryptocurrency that could be used in commerce and so on and so forth, right? The question of assets is going to be there. And so it's a matter of tokenizing these assets for the token itself. So this is like kind of reserve currency. And I had a hell of a time trying to explain this for like 3 years until Facebook Libras came out.
I was going to say, isn't this
Yep.
essentially what the Libra
Yep.
was meant to be, which is a basket
Yep.
of currencies? And yeah, now people understand it.
Yeah. So basically, Facebook spent X amount of millions of dollars educating the population. And finally, people are like, I could say it's like Facebook Libra. And they're like, oh, but yeah. But my model, I would say, is a lot more involved in their model. And it comes down to also, things of how we want it to be distributed, because being accessible is not enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's how you are distributed and how people earn it. For instance, with Libra, if you have to take your local fiat currency and then you have to buy Libra with it, there's no financial inclusion there at all, because you still need to go to an agent, you still need to go to a bank, you still need to onboard. But for us, we solve that with our concept of social proof of work, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And
I was very intrigued by that term. Tell our viewers what social proof of work is.
So social proof of work is a play on, proof of work, where, where you want to verify the transaction or, verify the blocks or so on and so forth. And so for us, we took that kind of analogy and said, okay, look, in order for there to be accessibility for ARCC, we basically want to give the ARCC for free, okay? But in exchange for data. And so in a lot of the emerging markets, there's no data on urban emerging markets. So when you look at a lot of like international social programs, they're done in like rural areas. The reason why they're done in rural areas is because you can control the environment, right? You have X number of farmers, X amount of land. But in urban centers, I mean, the population density is crazy. You have like 30 million people in a metropolitan area. Imagine like you had like 5 New York boroughs like packed in the size of like Manhattan,
Yeah.
like that's like the third world, like that's Southeast Asia, that's like South Asia, whatever like this. So you can't really do it. And in the Western world, when people get data from you, it's from how you purchase and what you search for, right? So when you're on Google and you're like, symptoms of a cold, Google can basically take all those people are typing for that and say, oh, there's an outbreak of this kind of flu or cold in this region. But in emerging markets, their interaction with data is totally different. Their interaction with data is mostly social. So they're using, a lot of them, their only interaction with the internet is through Facebook, right? Because Facebook provides that free with the carrier and stuff like that. And so then we're not really getting really good data from these individuals. And in actuality, these individuals, why we're not getting great data from them, because they're not really consumers either. They're kind of written off. So they're good for social metrics, like how many eyeballs are doing like on Facebook in like Southeast Asia, but they're not really revenue generating a population. But what we foresaw was that, or we have planned that if people can do like these surveys on their health, on even what they ate, what their diet was, did your baby get sick? When was the last time you were in the hospital? Do you know what your blood type is? Do you think that you have access to good drinking water, right? How far is it for you to, go to your local school? And we were able to do these surveys, and they were able to pay for these surveys. Then what we could do is we could create this kind of macro socioeconomic picture of these regions in depth, whether it be their health, their education, their debt status, their economic status, their family status. So even like how many cousins do you have? How many illegitimate cousins do you have, or brothers and sisters? How many fathers do you have? How many sisters do you have? Stuff like this. I mean, it sounds like crazy how many fathers you have, but yeah, some families are like that in these regions, and no one cares, and nobody has any data. And so the biggest thing is like, in these countries, who controls the media? It's the government or the private entities that have a lot of power, right? And so let's say that you're buying electricity, okay, and the electricity price has gone up 5% from last year, right? There's no data that you can get that shows that it actually went up 5% because they control the data. So they can just say, actually, you know what? 3 years ago, it was up 10%, so it's now up 5%, so it's a lot better for you. And you're like, where's this data coming from, right?
Yeah.
So what we wanted to do is that if we can create a base level of data over a year and a half, right? Then we can create clear public mandates saying, electricity is at this level per capita, this cost, or like water costs this much in this area, it needs to get down to this level. And that we can now like track it through all this data, not at an individual level, but like at a community level. And then for this data, we would give ARCC, because ultimately, if ARCC is related to creating some kind of radical social transparency,
which is the Asia reserve currency coin that you are working on through all of this. And then yes, I love that term. I was going to ask you about that as well. Radical social transparency.
Okay, so this term we stole a little bit from Ray Dalio. So Ray Dalio is an interesting character, person, leader. He runs the largest hedge fund in the world. They're taking a beating right now, but he's written a book, Principles, and he's very notorious for this one concept called radical transparency, where basically anyone that you work with, you need to talk to them very directly and like really explain to them why you like something or why you didn't like something, and then have a real transparency on what your strengths and your weaknesses are, so you can kind of work together. On a kind of play on that though, is that the biggest problem with the Southeast Asian or South Asian countries is a matter of corruption in general. Not every country, like obviously Singapore doesn't really have an issue of corruption, but other countries do, right? And it depends on which level. But how corruption actually really happens is because of lack of transparency. You don't know who's dealing who's getting what, what the data and the real facts are, right? So if we were able to basically get everyone organized, get organized into, how do I say, a framework where they could continually, provide data. And then we were able to also have a baseline of data and show how that data has changed. Then we would be able to create radical social transparency. So, if you look at like social media and Twitter or Facebook, there have been great strides where, there's a lot of transparency, right? But it's not organized. Like, okay, the government's doing something really corrupt, so we got to fight against that and we got to protest against that. But once the protest is done, nothing really happens because it's not data backed, right? It's social media communication mobilized, right? So what we're trying to do is basically the biggest thing that we can help for the productivity of these countries is provide social radical transparency. And if we do that, my theory is that if ARCC is responsible for financing the radical transparency of these developing countries, then it will be part of production. And once a currency is part of production or expression of production, then it should have its own value as well. So
yeah, so you're working on a project that has a clear social impact vision, and I'm really interested in that and supportive of that. Who are you looking to get involved with? If people want to know more, where should they go to find more information? Who do you want to most hear from, and how can they find you?
So we have a strategic partnership with development with Algorand. So all of our tokens and all our technology is based on the Algorand protocol. And you can visit our site at ibmr.io, or you can follow me on Twitter at Sinjin David Jung. And you can just send me a message. And who are we looking for? We don't have anyone in particular we're looking for. I mean, we're actually going to hire a whole bunch of data scientists because we're actually going to launch our ARCC1 like survey platform in the next couple of months, hopefully by the end of November. And on another practical like product basis, we launched the world's first micro equity stock exchange. And so basically we've launched a kind of microfinance stock exchange where we took one stock like Tesla and then we divided it into 10,000 increments, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then so they can be traded independently. So you have fractional shares that you can buy like from Robinhood or whatever or whatnot, but that price is identical to the actual main price. But if we actually tokenized it and we could create our own like microfinance market, that's what we've kind of already done. And you can use ARCC to buy into those equities. So you could buy with ARCC 1/10,000th of Tesla, which would be like 30 cents right now or something like that. But to get involved, yeah, just reach out to us on Twitter and stuff like that. We're self-funded. We're more looking, we have like 2 teams of developers out in Boston and in Singapore. But we're really looking for people to get involved on the community side. And then also, if you're a data scientist, we'd love to hear from you, and help us like formulate what kind of data would be most appropriate to create the most amount of social transparency in these regions.
Well, awesome. Yeah, I mean, I know quite a few data scientists and people who've worked at Lyft right before in autonomous vehicles, and definitely excited to share the information about what you're working on and these opportunities for data scientists to get hired. And yeah, so anyone who is passionate about approaching inequality in a way that aligns the right incentives and doesn't rely on the government stepping in, look into IMVR. So thank you so much, Sinjin, for joining us. And stick around, everyone, for more Reimagine 2020 coming up soon.
Thank you, Ashlie.